Autistic boy shocked everyone after being underestimated in the competition. Welcome, everyone. Today, I'm excited to share a heartwarming story that's not just about numbers, but about love, perseverance, and the strength we find when we face our greatest challenges. It's the journey of a young boy named Jacob, whose extraordinary talent and quiet determination will inspire you to believe that anything is possible with the right support. Jacob was always different. From the time he was a toddler, his quiet nature set him apart. While other children in his neighborhood laughed and played in the streets, Jacob preferred solitude, lost in his own world of puzzles and patterns. Diagnosed with autism at the age of 3, his parents, Mike and Emily, knew their son would face a different path in life. But they also saw something extraordinary in him, something few others could understand. Emily had always been Jacob's greatest supporter, a gentle woman with a heart full of love. She nurtured Jacob's unique gifts, encouraging him to explore numbers, shapes, and the hidden logic of the universe. But when she tragically passed away in a car accident when Jacob was just 6, the world around him collapsed. It was as though a light had gone out, and the quiet boy, who had already struggled with expressing himself, retreated even further into silence. Mike, Jacob's father, was a different man before the accident. A construction worker by trade, he had always been practical, hands-on, and a bit rough around the edges. But Emily's death changed him. Suddenly, he found himself not only grieving his wife, but also stepping into a role he had never imagined, being both father and mother to a boy he barely knew how to reach. Mike's world now revolved around Jacob. He saw the loneliness in his son's deep blue eyes, hidden beneath messy brown hair, and he felt helpless. Jacob didn't fit in with the other kids at school, nor did he communicate well with his teachers. Social situations were a minefield for him. Mike spent countless hours trying to connect with his son, trying to understand the boy Emily had always known so well. Yet, Jacob remained distant, lost in his thoughts and routines, rarely offering more than a few fragmented words. But one rainy afternoon, everything changed. Mike had been sitting at their small kitchen table, sorting through bills, sighing at the growing pile of late payments. Jacob, as usual, sat across from him, quietly fiddling with an old puzzle. The soft patter of rain on the window was the only sound in the room when, out of nowhere, Jacob spoke. "It's wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Mike looked up, startled. "What's wrong, buddy?" "The number," Jacob replied, pointing at the paper in front of Mike. "You added it wrong." For a moment, Mike was stunned. Jacob, who rarely engaged in any conversation, had just corrected his math. Curious, Mike slid the paper toward his son. "Show me." Jacob hesitated, his small hands trembling slightly as he picked up a pencil. Then, with focused precision, he scribbled down a new set of numbers. Mike checked the result. It was spot on. His heart raced. This was more than just a simple correction. It was a breakthrough. From that moment, Mike began to nurture Jacob's hidden talent. Each morning, their kitchen became a classroom, filled with mental math games, puzzles, and challenges that Mike found online. Slowly, Jacob's confidence began to grow, though his struggles with communication and social interaction remained. But in the world of numbers, Jacob found a language that made sense, a way to express himself when words failed. One day, while running errands, Mike noticed a flyer at the grocery store for the National Junior Mathematics Competition. His heart raced as he stared at it. Could Jacob, who barely spoke to anyone outside their home, stand on a stage and compete in front of an audience? It seemed impossible, but Mike couldn't ignore the glimmer of hope that had begun to flicker in his heart. Maybe this was Jacob's chance, not just to show the world his talent, but to break free from the isolation that had always held him back. So, with equal parts fear and determination, Mike took the flyer home and presented the idea to Jacob. The journey that would follow was one neither of them could have predicted, a journey filled with challenges, love, and the dream of a brighter future for a boy who saw the world through numbers. The decision to enter the National Junior Mathematics Competition was not one made lightly. For Mike, it wasn't just about Jacob's skill with numbers. It was about giving his son a chance to break free from the confines of his silent world. Yet, a deep sense of worry hung over him like a dark cloud. Mike had always known Jacob was different, but different didn't always equate to understanding from others. How would his quiet, introspective son, who still struggled with eye contact and conversation, handle the pressures of competition? But there was no denying it. Jacob was special. He saw patterns and solved problems that left even Mike, a practical man, in awe. In those moments, watching Jacob's fingers glide across the paper, scribbling numbers effortlessly, Mike couldn't help but wonder what his wife, Emily, would have thought. She had always seen something extraordinary in their son, and now Mike was beginning to see it too. Perhaps this competition was more than just a challenge. Perhaps it was a step toward the future Emily had always dreamed of for Jacob. Still, the journey to the competition was daunting. Mike knew the road ahead would not be easy. Beyond the financial struggles, there was the deeper concern of Jacob's anxiety, how he clammed up in the presence of others, how the mere thought of being around unfamiliar faces sent him into a state of panic. Mike remembered the many mornings when he had to gently coax Jacob out of bed for school, knowing full well that each day was a battlefield for his son. How could he expect Jacob to perform in front of an audience when even the grocery store could overwhelm him? The answer, Mike realized, lay not in forcing Jacob out of his comfort zone, but in helping him expand it, step by step, with love and patience. And so, their small kitchen became a sanctuary of learning and growth. Mike started by creating a daily routine for Jacob, one filled with numbers, logic puzzles, and math problems that sparked joy in his son. It wasn't just about preparing for the competition. It was about building Jacob's confidence in a way that had never been done before. But it wasn't enough to simply practice alone. Mike knew that Jacob needed to be exposed to the world outside their home, to feel the presence of others and still find his footing. That's when he decided to take Jacob to the town library. The library was a place of quiet study, where Mike thought Jacob might feel more comfortable. They began spending their afternoons there, where Jacob would work on problems in front of a small whiteboard. At first, they were alone, just father and son. But eventually, other visitors started to notice them. Each time a passerby stopped to watch, Mike could feel the tension build in Jacob's small body. His son would grip the markers so tightly his knuckles turned white, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Mike's heart ached with every flinch, every fearful glance. He would kneel beside Jacob, his voice calm and steady, offering words of encouragement. "It's just numbers, buddy," Mike would say softly. "You've got this. Don't worry about anyone else. Just focus." Gradually, Jacob began to relax in these moments. His hands stopped shaking. His mind returned to the comfort of the numbers. And slowly but surely, he found his way back to the work in front of him. Mike saw the transformation, small but significant. Every day that Jacob faced the unknown and came out the other side was a victory, not just in math but in life. Each step forward, however tentative, was a testament to Jacob's resilience and Mike's unwavering support. However, the true test came one Saturday afternoon when Mike found a local math competition, smaller than the national event, but still a step outside of Jacob's familiar world. It was held in the community center cafeteria, a modest venue. Yet to Mike and Jacob, it felt like the largest stage in the world. The moment they entered, Mike felt the weight of curious and judgmental stares from other parents. Their whispered conversations about Jacob's odd behavior filling the room like static. But Jacob didn't hear them. His eyes were fixed on the notebook in his hands, his mind already lost in the numbers. When the competition began, he sat at his assigned seat, head down, focusing intently on the problems before him. To Mike, it was like watching a butterfly fight its way out of its cocoon, fragile, yet determined. The hours dragged on, and when it was finally time to announce the results, Mike could barely breathe. He didn't care about winning. He only wanted Jacob to feel proud, to know that he was capable. When they called Jacob's name for first place, the room fell silent before erupting in applause. Mike rushed to his son's side. tears in his eyes. "You did it, Jacob," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You really did it." In that moment, it wasn't just about the win. It was about Jacob proving, not to others but to himself, that he was more than his struggles. It was about the love between father and son, the patience and belief that, together, they could overcome anything. This was just the beginning of a journey that would push them both beyond their limits. But for the first time, Mike felt a glimmer of hope. Jacob's dreams, however difficult to reach, suddenly felt a little closer. In the days following Jacob's victory at the local math competition, a sense of pride filled the small home he shared with Mike. It wasn't just about the first-place medal that now hung proudly in their kitchen. It was about something far deeper. For Jacob, the win was proof that his world of numbers, once a private refuge, could also be a bridge to something more. It was a small but powerful step toward a future that had once seemed unreachable. Mike, on the other hand, felt both exhilaration and fear. He had watched his son grow in ways he had never expected. But now, with the National Junior Mathematics Competition looming just a few months away, a new wave of anxiety settled over him. The national stage would be different, bigger, harsher. It wasn't just about Jacob's ability to solve math problems. It was about whether he could handle the pressure, the expectations, and the overwhelming presence of others. The truth weighed heavily on Mike. Despite his son's growing confidence with numbers, Jacob still found it difficult to communicate outside their tight circle. The moment another voice, another person's presence, entered the room, Jacob's world seemed to shrink. His brilliant mind became clouded by anxiety, and the calm precision with which he worked alone disappeared in the crowd. How would he face the national competition, where he would be surrounded by hundreds of strangers, all watching, all judging? Mike spent sleepless nights thinking about how to prepare Jacob, not just for the competition, but for the world that awaited him beyond it. The financial strain was another burden, one that gnawed at Mike's conscience daily. The competition required travel, registration fees, and even a wardrobe that would allow Jacob to present himself with confidence. But money was tight. Ever since Emily's passing, Mike had juggled construction jobs and small side projects just to keep them afloat. Every dollar went toward their basic needs, and though they had received some support from the community, it wasn't enough to cover everything. But Mike knew he couldn't give up. He had seen the spark in Jacob's eyes, the excitement that came alive when he worked through a challenging problem. That spark was something rare, something precious, and Mike was determined to do everything he could to keep it burning. The world didn't often understand kids like Jacob, but Mike did. He had learned, through trial and error, through moments of frustration and moments of grace, how to speak Jacob's language, the language of patience, love, and belief. Each day, they practiced together. Mike filled their living room with makeshift math stations, scribbling equations on whiteboards, setting up timed problem-solving sessions, and simulating the competition environment as best as he could. He watched as Jacob's hands moved rapidly, pencil flying across the paper, each calculation executed with the precision of a seasoned mathematician. But it wasn't just the math that mattered now. Mike pushed Jacob to speak out loud, to explain his process, to engage in the kind of communication that the national competition would demand. It wasn't easy. There were days when Jacob, overwhelmed, would close in on himself, his words becoming fragmented, his hands trembling as they clutched his notebook. On those days, Mike would sit beside him, offering quiet reassurance. "Breathe, Jacob," he would whisper. "Take your time. We'll do this together." And together they did, slowly but surely. Jacob began to find his voice. It wasn't perfect. His sentences were still halting, his words often hesitant, but he was trying. And for Mike, that was everything. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, surrounded by math problems and practice sheets, Jacob looked up at his father, his brow furrowed in thought. "Do I have to talk in front of all those people?" he asked, his voice quiet but steady. Mike's heart ached at the vulnerability in Jacob's question. He knew how much his son feared crowds. how the very idea of standing in front of an audience made him recoil. But this was a part of the journey, a part of the dream they were chasing together. "Yes, buddy," Mike answered gently. "But you're not alone. I'll be right there with you, every step of the way." Jacob nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of fear and determination. "I want to win," he said simply, echoing the words he had spoken after his first competition. But this time, there was something different in his voice, something more resolute. And in that moment, Mike knew they were ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. They had come too far to turn back now. For the first time in a long while, Mike felt a quiet confidence settle in his chest. They were moving forward, together, toward a future filled with possibility. As the days inched closer to the competition, they both understood one thing. The journey was no longer just about numbers. It was about courage, love, and the belief that anything was possible if they faced it side by side. The day of the pre-competition seminar arrived faster than either Mike or Jacob had anticipated. It was a crisp morning, the sky a soft blend of early light and gray clouds, reflecting the quiet apprehension both father and son felt. Mike had tried to prepare Jacob for this, the noise, the crowd, the unfamiliarity of it all. But there was only so much he could explain in words. The reality would be different. Mike knew it. He had seen the way Jacob tensed up when a stranger so much as glanced in his direction. As they drove to the university, hosting the event, the air between them was filled with a mixture of quiet tension and hope. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, clutching his notebook as if it were a lifeline. Mike stole a few glances at him from time to time, wishing he could ease his son's anxiety. But there were no easy answers for what Jacob was feeling. How could anyone prepare for facing the unknown, especially for a boy like Jacob, who had always struggled with new experiences and places? "Remember, buddy," Mike said, his voice soft but firm. "It's just you and the numbers. Nothing else matters." Jacob didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the passing landscape. But Mike knew he was listening. He always listened, even when he didn't speak. When they arrived, the university campus was buzzing with activity. The seminar was designed to prepare students for the competition by not only reviewing math concepts, but also helping participants develop presentation skills and confidence in a public setting. Mike knew this was going to be the real challenge for Jacob. His mathematical abilities were never in question. But standing in front of others, communicating his thoughts, this was the mountain they had yet to fully climb. As they entered the large auditorium, Jacob's shoulders hunched forward, his body shrinking inward as he took in the crowded room. Parents and students were everywhere, chatting, laughing, and finding their seats. The hum of voices and the movement of bodies seemed to close in on Jacob, his grip on the notebook tightening. Mike placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, giving him a gentle squeeze. "Just breathe," he whispered. "We're going to be okay." They took their seats near the back of the room, where the crowd felt a little less overwhelming. Jacob stayed quiet, his eyes darting nervously from face to face. But Mike noticed something else. His son was holding steady. Though the anxiety was there, it wasn't paralyzing him. This was progress. Mike thought to himself, small, but significant. The seminar began with an introduction from one of the competition coordinators, a woman named Ms. Hawthorne. She spoke about the challenges of the competition, emphasizing not just mathematical skill, but the importance of communication, collaboration, and presentation. Mike felt his chest tighten with each word she spoke. He knew these were all things Jacob struggled with, and hearing them laid out so plainly made the obstacles ahead seem even larger. But then Mike glanced at Jacob, who was sitting upright, listening intently. His son wasn't backing down. In that moment, Mike realized something important. Jacob wanted this. He wanted to rise to the challenge, even if it terrified him. The seminar transitioned into smaller group activities, where the students would work together to solve problems and present their solutions. Mike watched from the sidelines as Jacob was placed with 3 other children. A girl named Sophie seemed to naturally take charge, dividing the tasks between them. Jacob stayed quiet, his hands fidgeting with his pencil, but his eyes were locked on the numbers. At one point, Sophie turned to Jacob. "Can you help with this part?" she asked. pointing to an equation that had stumped the group. For a moment, Jacob froze. Mike could see the panic flare up in his son's eyes. This was the kind of moment that could either break Jacob or push him to a new level. Slowly, Jacob nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. I think you have to divide here. His sentences were short, fragmented, but he had spoken, and when he leaned forward to scribble his solution on the paper, Mike felt his heart swell with pride. The other students exchanged glances, unsure at first, but when Sophie checked his work, her eyes widened. That's right, she exclaimed, looking at Jacob with a mixture of surprise and admiration. Jacob didn't smile, didn't even look up. He simply returned to his quiet space. But Mike saw the change. It wasn't about praise for Jacob. It was about knowing he could do it. He could solve the problem. He could contribute. And that was enough. As the group work continued, Jacob slowly began to speak more. Each word was an effort, each sentence a victory. Mike watched with tears in his eyes, knowing that this was only the first hurdle, but it was one they had just overcome together. At the end of the seminar, Ms. Hawthorne approached Mike and Jacob, her smile kind but measured. He's got real potential, she said, glancing at Jacob. I know it's hard for him, but if he can keep pushing through, he's going to surprise a lot of people. Mike nodded, his heart full of both pride and worry. He knew this was only the beginning. The real test, the national competition, was still ahead. But for the first time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, they were ready to face it. Jacob looked up at his father, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. I want to win, Dad, he said softly, echoing the words from before. This time, though, they carried more weight. Mike smiled, ruffling his son's hair. We will, buddy, we will. The weeks following the seminar were filled with both progress and tension. Mike could see it in Jacob's eyes. His son was determined. But there was a heaviness about him that hadn't been there before. The weight of the upcoming national competition, the expectations, and the sheer enormity of the stage he was about to step on hung over their small home like a shadow. Mike felt it too, but he knew he had to remain steady for Jacob. After all, this wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about proving something to the world. And most importantly, to themselves. They practiced every day. Each morning, Mike would set up the living room with practice sheets, timers, and even a small whiteboard where Jacob could solve problems as if he were on stage. As always, Jacob tackled the math with focus and precision, his mind working through complex equations as easily as breathing. But it was the speaking, the explaining, that still tied him in knots. Mike watched him struggle, watched the anxiety creep in whenever he had to explain his thought process aloud. Sometimes Jacob's voice would falter, his words coming out jumbled, and frustration would flash across his face. In those moments, Mike's heart ached for his son, knowing that this challenge, this social barrier, was the real hurdle they had to overcome. One evening, after an especially difficult practice session, Mike found Jacob sitting alone at the kitchen table, his hands resting on a sheet of math problems he had long since finished. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and confusion, his deep blue eyes distant. Lost in thought, Mike sat down beside him, not saying anything at first, just letting the silence between them settle. After a while, Jacob spoke, his voice soft but clear. Why is it so hard, Dad? He asked, looking up at Mike with a vulnerability that cut straight to his heart. The math, it's easy, but everything else, it's so hard. Mike took a deep breath, steadying himself before answering. He reached out and gently placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Sometimes the things we're best that come easily, but the things that push us beyond our comfort zone, those are the real challenges, he said, his voice calm and steady. And it's okay to feel scared, to feel like it's hard. That just means you're growing. Jacob's brow furrowed, as if he were trying to make sense of his father's words. But what if I can't do it? What if I mess up in front of everyone? Mike felt the weight of those questions settle in his chest. They were the same doubts that had kept him awake at night, the same fears that had gnawed at him since the moment they decided to pursue the competition. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. Jacob had already proven so much. You know what, Jacob? Mike said after a pause, his voice filled with quiet conviction. You've already done more than most people ever will. You've worked so hard, and no matter what happens at the competition, you've already won in my eyes. It's not about being perfect. It's about showing up and doing your best. That's all anyone can ask. Jacob looked at his father for a long moment, the worry in his expression slowly giving way to something else, something deeper. It wasn't quite confidence, but it was a glimmer of understanding. He nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of what Mike had said. I want to do it, Jacob whispered. I want to try. Mike smiled, his heart swelling with pride. That's all I needed to hear, buddy. From that day on, their training sessions took on a new rhythm. Mike focused not just on the math, but on building Jacob's confidence in small, incremental ways. They practiced speaking together, role-playing different scenarios where Jacob would have to explain his process. And every time Jacob's voice faltered, Mike was there to offer reassurance. You got this, Jacob, he would say softly. Just breathe. But there was another worry that loomed over Mike, the financial burden. The costs for the competition were more than he had anticipated. The travel, the registration, even the simple expense of making sure Jacob had appropriate clothes for the event were adding up faster than Mike could handle. His construction work provided enough to get by, but not much more. And despite the support from the community, they were still short. Mike spent late nights at the kitchen table, flipping through bills, trying to figure out where they could cut costs. The weight of the financial strain bore down on him, threatening to overshadow the hope they had worked so hard to build. But he refused to let it crush them. He had promised Jacob they would face this together, and that meant pushing through the worry, through the exhaustion, through the fear. One evening, after a particularly long day, Mike looked across the table at Jacob, who was scribbling away on a fresh sheet of problems. His son's face was lit by the soft glow of the kitchen light. And in that moment, Mike realized something. No matter how hard this journey was, no matter the sacrifices, it was worth it. Jacob's dream, his future, was worth every struggle, every sleepless night. And together, they would find a way to make it work. Because dreams, Mike knew, were built not just on talent, but on love, perseverance, and the courage to rise up when the world tried to hold you down. And Jacob had all of that in abundance. The days rolled on, and as the national competition drew closer, so did the tension in their small household. Mike could feel it, like a tangible weight pressing down on him, and he knew Jacob felt it too. They were both walking a fine line between hope and fear, between the excitement of what could be and the dread of what might go wrong. But something else had begun to change, too. As each day passed, Mike noticed a subtle shift in Jacob's demeanor. There was still the quietness that had always been a part of him, the hesitation that came with interacting with the world. But now, there was also a new kind of determination, a flicker of resolve that hadn't been there before. It wasn't bold or loud, but it was there, simmering just beneath the surface. Their daily practice sessions continued, but they weren't just about numbers anymore. Mike had shifted the focus toward building Jacob's confidence, helping him find his voice. Even when it trembled, he knew that math alone wouldn't win this competition. Jacob needed to be able to stand up in front of a crowd, to explain his reasoning, to let people see not just the answers he came up with, but the brilliance behind them. And so, Mike pushed him gently but firmly, encouraging Jacob to speak more, to express his thoughts, even when the words didn't come easily. Some days were harder than others. There were still moments when Jacob would freeze, when the anxiety would build up so high that it felt like a wall between him and the world. In those moments, Mike could see the panic in his son's eyes, the way his hands would clench around his pencil as if holding on for dear life. But Mike never wavered. He would sit beside Jacob, offering the same quiet reassurance he always had. It's okay, buddy, he'd say softly. Just take your time. We'll get through this together. And slowly, bit by bit, Jacob did. His words became a little steadier, his explanations a little clearer. He still wasn't comfortable with it, but he was trying, and that was all Mike could ask for. Yet even as they made progress, the The financial strain continued to loom over them. Mike had been working extra hours at the construction site, taking on every side job he could find to make ends meet. But no matter how many hours he worked, the money still seemed to slip through his fingers. The cost of the competition was daunting. Travel, registration, accommodations, it all added up, and Mike found himself staring at the bills late into the night, wondering how he was going to pull it off. He knew he couldn't let Jacob see his worry. His son had enough to carry on his shoulders without the added burden of financial stress. So Mike kept it to himself, doing his best to shield Jacob from the reality of their situation. He didn't want Jacob to feel like his dreams were too expensive, too difficult to achieve. Because in Mike's heart, he knew that dreams like Jacob's were priceless, worth every sacrifice. One evening, as they sat together at the kitchen table, reviewing another set of math problems, Jacob looked up at his father, his brow furrowed in concern. "Are we going to be okay, Dad?" he asked quietly, his voice filled with an uncertainty that Mike hadn't heard in a while. Mike paused, caught off guard by the question. He hadn't realized how much Jacob had picked up on, how aware his son was of the undercurrent of worry that had been flowing through their home. For a moment, Mike didn't know what to say. He wanted to protect Jacob from the harsh realities of their financial situation. But he also knew that Jacob was no longer a little boy. He was growing up, and he deserved the truth. "We're going to be okay, Jacob," Mike said finally, his voice steady. "It's not easy, but we've come this far, and we're not giving up now." Jacob nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "I don't want to give up," he said softly. "I just want to do my best." Mike smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "That's all that matters, buddy. As long as you do your best, we'll figure everything else out." But even as he said the words, Mike couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. The deadline for registration fees was fast approaching, and they were still short. No amount of extra shifts or side jobs seemed to be enough. He had thought about asking the community for more help, but something inside him held back. He didn't want to seem like a burden, and he didn't want Jacob to feel like his dream was something they had to beg for. Still, the situation grew more desperate with each passing day. Mike was running out of options. He had tried everything, had given everything, and yet, it still didn't feel like enough. How was he supposed to tell Jacob that after all their hard work, after everything they had fought for, they might not even be able to go to the competition? Then, one evening, just as Mike was beginning to lose hope, there was a knock on the door. He opened it to find their elderly neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, standing there with a small, worn envelope in his hands. The man's eyes were kind, his voice soft as he spoke. "I heard about Jacob's competition," Mr. Reynolds said, pressing the envelope into Mike's hands. "Emily was a dear friend of mine. She'd be so proud of him. This is for Jacob." Mike stood there in stunned silence as Mr. Reynolds turned and walked away. Inside the envelope was a modest sum of money and a note that simply read, "For Jacob, with love." It wasn't enough to cover everything, but it was a start, a reminder that they weren't alone in this fight. Tears filled Mike's eyes as he looked at the envelope. The kindness of one man had reignited the hope he had almost lost. And as he turned to Jacob, who was watching him from across the room, he felt a surge of determination rise up within him. They were going to make this work, one way or another. They were going to make it, because Jacob's dream wasn't just his alone, it was theirs. And they would face whatever came next, side by side. The knock from Mr. Reynolds wasn't just a gesture of kindness. It was a spark of something much larger. In the days that followed, word of Jacob's journey began to spread through the small town like wildfire. It started with the humble envelope Mr. Reynolds had delivered. But soon, others began to follow. Neighbors who had known Mike and Jacob for years. Local shop owners who had watched Jacob grow from a shy boy into a quietly determined young man. And even some of Jacob's former teachers. All of them reached out. Each day, new envelopes arrived at their doorstep. Some contained modest sums of money. Others were filled with words of encouragement. Small notes reminding them that they weren't alone in this journey. Mike was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. It wasn't just the financial help, though that was more than appreciated. It was the feeling of community, the sense that so many people believed in Jacob's dream, in his potential. As each donation arrived, Mike would sit Jacob down at the kitchen table and share the notes with him. At first, Jacob seemed unsure of what to make of it all. His quiet world of numbers had never intersected much with the people around him, and the idea that all these individuals were rooting for him, supporting him, was difficult for him to grasp. But as the days passed, Mike saw a change in his son's eyes, a quiet understanding of the love and belief that was being placed in him. "They believe in you, Jacob," Mike would say softly, passing him another note. "They want to see you succeed." Jacob would nod, his fingers tracing the words on the small slips of paper, his eyes thoughtful. There was still that flicker of fear, that quiet doubt that he carried with him. But now it was tempered by something else, something new. It was as though, for the first time, Jacob was beginning to realize that he wasn't just doing this for himself. He was part of something bigger. His journey, his dream, had become intertwined with the hopes and kindness of the people around him. One evening, after reading through another stack of letters, Jacob looked up at Mike, his expression more resolute than Mike had ever seen. "I want to do this, Dad," he said quietly. "Not just for me, for them too." Mike's heart swelled with pride, and for a moment, he found himself speechless. He had always known that Jacob was special, that his talent with numbers was extraordinary. But this was something deeper. This was his son growing into a young man, one who understood the power of community, of empathy, and of giving back. As the days passed, the donations slowly added up. The financial stress that had weighed so heavily on Mike's shoulders began to lift. It wasn't just the money, it was the sense that they were being carried forward by the love and support of the people around them. And with each donation, with each note of encouragement, Mike felt a renewed determination. He had promised Jacob they would face this together. And now, with the help of their community, that promise was becoming a reality. The registration fees were paid, the travel arrangements made, and even Jacob's wardrobe, something Mike had worried about in quiet moments late at night, was taken care of. A local tailor had offered to help, providing Jacob with a suit that fit him perfectly, a small gesture, but one that made all the difference. When Jacob stood in front of the mirror, wearing the suit for the first time, Mike saw something new in his son's reflection. Confidence. It wasn't bold or loud, but it was there, subtle and steady. "You look sharp, buddy," Mike said, his voice full of warmth. Jacob didn't say much, but the small smile that tugged at the corner of his lips spoke volumes. Finally, the day of the national competition drew near. The night before they were set to leave, Mike sat with Jacob at the kitchen table, going over the final details. The room was filled with a quiet anticipation. It was hard to believe how far they had come, how much they had overcome just to get here. As they packed up the last of Jacob's things, Mike felt a wave of emotion wash over him. This wasn't just about a competition anymore. It was about everything they had faced together, the obstacles they had overcome, the love that had carried them through. "Are you ready?" Mike asked, his voice soft but steady. Jacob nodded, his hands resting on the edge of his suitcase. "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice full of determination. "I'm ready." And for the first time in a long while, Mike believed it. Jacob was ready, not just for the competition, but for everything that lay ahead. He had grown in ways Mike hadn't even imagined. And it wasn't just about his math skills. It was about his heart, his understanding of the world around him, and his ability to rise to any challenge, no matter how daunting. As they closed the suitcase and prepared for the journey ahead, Mike couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of pride. His son had already won the most important battle, the battle within himself. Now, they would face the rest of the journey together, knowing that no matter the outcome, they had already achieved something far greater than any trophy. They had found strength in each other, in their community, and in the quiet, persistent belief that dreams, no matter how difficult, were always worth chasing. The morning of the national competition arrived with a sense of nervous anticipation hanging in the air. The journey had brought them to this moment, and yet, it felt almost surreal. Mike and Jacob stood at the entrance of the auditorium, surrounded by other students and their families. The hum of excitement and nerves vibrating through the hall. This was the culmination of months of hard work. But it was also the beginning of something even greater, a test not just of Jacob's mathematical talent, but of his courage and resilience. Mike looked over at Jacob, who stood quietly by his side, clutching his notebook as he always did. There was a calmness about him now, though Mike could see the tension in his son's shoulders, the slight tremble in his fingers as they tightened around the edges of the notebook. But Jacob's eyes, those deep blue eyes that had so often reflected uncertainty, were focused now, filled with a quiet determination. "You got this, buddy," Mike whispered, leaning down so that only Jacob could hear. "Remember, it's just you and the numbers." Jacob nodded, not taking his eyes off the stage where the competition would soon take place. There was no doubt in Mike's mind that Jacob was ready. He had seen his son push himself in ways that still amazed him, facing his fears and stepping out of his comfort zone, not for the glory or the accolades, but because he wanted to prove something to himself. The competition began with a written test designed to eliminate half of the participants in the first round. It was a tense silence that fell over the auditorium as the students bent over their papers, pencils scratching against the surface as they worked through the problems. Mike watched from the sidelines, his heart in his throat, his eyes fixed on Jacob's small figure at the front of the room. Jacob was calm, his head down, his pencil moving with precision. For him, this was the easy part. The numbers were familiar, like old friends. The equations made sense in a way the rest of the world often didn't. It was a language he understood instinctively, one that gave him comfort even in the most stressful situations. When the time for the written test came to an end, the students handed in their papers and retreated to their seats. The room buzzed with nervous energy as everyone waited for the results to be announced. Mike could feel his own pulse quicken, but Jacob remained steady, his hands still resting on his notebook as if it were his anchor. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the names of the students who had made it to the next round were called out. Mike held his breath as each name was read, the tension in the room rising with each pause. And then, finally, he heard it: Jacob Parker. Mike let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his heart swelling with pride. Jacob glanced back at him, his expression still calm, but there was a flicker of relief in his eyes. Mike gave him a thumbs up, fighting back the emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. They had made it through the first hurdle, but the biggest challenge was still ahead. The next round was the real test, a live problem-solving session in front of a panel of judges and an audience. This was what Mike had worried about most. Jacob's talent with numbers had never been in question, but standing in front of a room full of strangers, explaining his process, was something else entirely. As Jacob's group was called up to the stage, Mike could see the slight tension return to his son's body. His hands clutched the marker a little too tightly, his posture rigid. But Jacob didn't back down. He walked to the board with steady steps, his eyes focused on the problem in front of him. The equation was complex, requiring not just mathematical skill, but quick thinking and clarity in communication. For a moment, Jacob stood frozen, his mind racing as he stared at the board. Mike's heart sank, knowing the internal battle Jacob was fighting, the pressure, the fear of speaking in front of so many people. "Come on, Jacob," Mike whispered under his breath, willing his son to find the strength he knew was there. And then, something shifted. Jacob took a deep breath, his grip on the marker loosening. Slowly, he began to speak, his voice quiet at first, but growing stronger with each word. His sentences were still halting, still fragmented. But the math was flawless. He moved through the steps with precision, isolating variables, solving equations, all while explaining his reasoning in the best way he could. The audience, which had been murmuring with skepticism, gradually fell silent, watching in awe as Jacob worked his way through the problem. Mike felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes as he watched his son stand there, not just solving the equation, but overcoming every obstacle that had stood in his way. When Jacob finally finished, he turned to the judges, his eyes wide with uncertainty. For a moment, the room was still. Then, the applause erupted, filling the auditorium with a roar that shook the walls. One of the judges, a stern-looking woman in glasses, stood up and spoke into the microphone. That was an outstanding solution. Jacob Parker. Well done. Jacob blinked, as if he hadn't quite understood what had just happened. Then, slowly, a small, triumphant smile spread across his face. He had done it. He had faced his fear, and he had won. Mike rushed to his son's side as soon as he stepped off the stage, pulling him into a tight embrace. His voice choked with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, buddy. You did it." But the competition wasn't over yet. There was still one final round, a head-to-head match with the top participants. Yet, in Mike's heart, he already knew the truth. No matter what happened next, Jacob had already achieved something far greater than any trophy. He had found his strength, his voice, and the belief that he could face the world. One step at a time, the air in the auditorium was electric. The applause from Jacob's last round still echoed faintly in Mike's ears. But now the room had grown quiet again, heavy with anticipation. The final round was about to begin. This was the moment that would determine the champion of the national mathematics competition. But as Mike stood at the edge of the stage, watching his son prepare for the last test, he realized that the real victory had already been won. Jacob, who had once been so afraid of the world, so withdrawn and hesitant, now stood tall, shoulders squared, facing the biggest challenge of his life. It was a transformation that filled Mike's heart with pride. And yet, there was still a flicker of anxiety deep in his chest. He knew this round would be the toughest. The problems would be complex, the pressure immense. And though Jacob had shown incredible strength, this was a different kind of battle, one against time, against competition, and, perhaps hardest of all, against his own nerves. The judges explained the rules. 3 finalists, 3 problems, and 1 chance to prove their skills. The competitors were seated at separate stations, facing the audience and the panel of judges, who would watch every move, every calculation. It was a test of speed, accuracy, and clarity, qualities that Jacob possessed, but only when the anxiety didn't cloud his thoughts. Mike could see Jacob's hands resting on the table, fingers lightly tapping against the edge. It was a small sign, one that Mike had come to recognize over the years, of his son's rising nerves. But there was no turning back now. Jacob knew that. He had come too far to let fear take over. The first problem appeared on the large screen behind the stage. It was an intricate equation, one that would require deep concentration and careful execution. Mike watched as Jacob's eyes scanned the numbers, his mind already at work. For a few tense moments, the auditorium was filled with nothing but the sound of pencils scratching against paper as the finalists tackled the challenge. Jacob's movements were deliberate, precise, just as they had always been during their practice sessions. But this time, something was different. There was a calmness about him that Mike hadn't seen before. It was as if, for the first time, Jacob wasn't just thinking about the numbers. He was in control of them. The anxiety that had once consumed him seemed to fade away, replaced by a quiet confidence that had taken root inside him over the past months. One by one, the other competitors began to falter. Their pencils paused, their brows furrowed in confusion as the complexity of the problem began to overwhelm them. But Jacob continued, his focus unwavering, his hands moving steadily as he worked through the equation. Then, with a final stroke of his pencil, Jacob finished. He looked up at the judges, his face calm but intense. Mike felt a surge of pride swell in his chest. His son had finished first, but more importantly, he had finished strong. The judges reviewed the solutions, their faces betraying nothing. The audience held its breath, the silence almost unbearable as they waited for the final decision. Mike could hardly breathe, his heart pounding in his chest as he watched the judges confer. Then, finally, the head judge stood up and cleared his throat. The winner of this year's National Junior Mathematics Competition is Jacob Parker. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Mike's eyes widened, disbelief washing over him as the words sunk in. And then, the auditorium erupted in applause, cheers filling the air as Jacob's name echoed off the walls. Mike felt tears sting his eyes, and he didn't try to stop them. His son had done it. He had won. Jacob sat there for a moment, blinking in stunned silence as the realization hit him. Slowly, he rose from his seat, his eyes searching the crowd until they found Mike. In that instant, everything else faded away. The noise, the people, the pressure. It was just the two of them, father and son, sharing a moment that neither would ever forget. Mike rushed to the stage, pulling Jacob into his arms, his voice choked with emotion. "You did it, Jacob," he whispered, holding his son tight. "I'm so proud of you. You showed everyone what you're made of." Jacob didn't say much. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes, the quiet smile on his face, said everything. He had proven to the world, and more importantly, to himself, that he was capable of more than anyone had ever expected. As they stood there, surrounded by the cheers of the crowd, Mike felt an overwhelming sense of peace settle over him. This moment was more than just a victory in a competition. It was the culmination of a journey that had tested both of them in ways they couldn't have imagined. They had faced fears, overcome obstacles, and risen to challenges that had once seemed impossible. And through it all, they had done it together, side by side. The judges handed Jacob his trophy, a symbol of his accomplishment. But to Mike, the real prize was something far greater. It was the strength Jacob had found within himself, the courage to step out of the shadows and into the light. That was the true victory. As they made their way off the stage, Mike looked down at his son, his heart full. "You did it, buddy," he said again, his voice soft but filled with pride. "You really did it." Jacob looked up at his father, his eyes shining. "We did it, Dad," he corrected gently. And in that moment, Mike knew that Jacob was right. They had done this together, and no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would continue to face them, as always, side by side. The days following Jacob's victory were a whirlwind of congratulations, interviews, and unexpected attention. The small town that had once overlooked the quiet, reserved boy now celebrated him as a local hero. Everywhere they went, people stopped to congratulate Jacob, shaking Mike's hand and offering words of praise. Teachers who had once doubted Jacob's abilities called to apologize for their lack of understanding, while community members who had helped fund their journey sent heartfelt letters, their words filled with pride and admiration. For Mike, the joy of Jacob's win was almost too much to take in. It felt like a dream, a culmination of years of struggle, fear, and the relentless pursuit of a dream that had once seemed so far out of reach. Yet, in the middle of all the excitement, Mike found himself reflecting on how far they had come, not just in the competition, but as a family. The real victory, he realized, wasn't the trophy or the recognition. It was the strength they had both discovered along the way. Jacob handled the attention with quiet grace. He was still the same boy he had always been, humble, thoughtful, and reserved, but now there was a new sense of confidence in the way he carried himself. He no longer seemed afraid of being noticed. In fact, when people approached him to ask about the competition, he would answer their questions with a calmness that amazed Mike. It wasn't just his mathematical ability that had grown. Jacob had grown too, in ways Mike hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, as they sat together in their living room, surrounded by the cards and letters of support that had flooded in, Mike turned to Jacob, his voice gentle. "How are you feeling about everything, buddy? It's been a lot to take in, hasn't it?" Jacob nodded, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the trophy that now sat on the table between them. He was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "It feels different," he said slowly, looking up at Mike. "Like I've changed, but I'm still the same." Mike smiled, understanding exactly what his son meant. "That's because you've always been this strong, Jacob. You've always had this in you. The competition didn't change you. It just helped you see what you were capable of." Jacob tilted his head, thinking about his father's words. "I didn't do it alone," he said quietly. "You were there the whole time, and so many people helped us." Mike felt his heart swell with emotion. "You're right, buddy. We did this together, all of us. But you're the one who stepped up. You're the one who faced the fear, the pressure, That took real courage. Jacob's gaze fell to the trophy once more, his fingers brushing over the engraved lettering. "I'm glad I did it," he whispered. "Not just for me, but for everyone who believed in me." It was in that moment that Mike realized just how much Jacob had grown, not only in confidence, but in empathy and understanding. This journey had shaped his son in ways that went far beyond math. Jacob had learned the value of perseverance, of community, and of the quiet strength that comes from overcoming personal challenges. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail from a prestigious mathematics academy, one that specialized in nurturing young talent. The academy had heard about Jacob's win and wanted to offer him a full scholarship, an opportunity to study among the brightest minds in the country. Mike sat at the kitchen table, holding the letter with shaking hands. This was an opportunity beyond anything they had imagined. But with it came a flood of new emotions. Could Jacob handle living away from home? Could Mike bear to let him go? Later that evening, Mike shared the letter with Jacob, watching his son's face as he read through the words. Jacob was quiet, as always, but Mike could see the wheels turning in his mind. "Do you want to go?" Mike asked gently, trying to keep the emotion out of his voice. Jacob didn't answer right away. He stared at the letter for a long time, his brow furrowed in thought. "I want to learn more," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I don't want to leave you." Mike felt tears prick at his eyes, but he forced a smile. "You don't have to decide right now, buddy. Whatever you choose, I'll support you. We'll figure it out together." For the next few days, they talked about the decision, weighing the pros and cons, visiting the academy's website, and learning about what it would be like for Jacob to attend. Mike knew that this was an incredible opportunity, one that could open doors for Jacob's future. But it also meant stepping into a new, unfamiliar world, one that neither of them had ever imagined. In the end, it was Jacob who made the decision. Sitting at the kitchen table one evening, he looked up at Mike, his eyes clear and determined. "I want to go," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm scared, but I want to try." Mike's heart swelled with pride as he reached out to ruffle Jacob's hair. "I'm proud of you, buddy," he said softly. "No matter where you go, I'll always be right there with you." And so, with a mixture of excitement and trepidation, they began the next chapter of their journey, one that would take Jacob to new heights, with new challenges and new dreams to chase. But no matter how far he went, Mike knew that the bond they had built through love, resilience, and shared hope would always keep them close. They had faced the impossible and come out stronger on the other side. And now they were ready to face whatever the future held, together. Thank you all for watching and joining us on Jacob's incredible journey. His story is a reminder that true strength lies in perseverance, love, and the courage to rise above life's challenges. We hope it has touched your heart as much as it has ours. If you found this story inspiring, please give the video a like, share it with others, and don't forget to subscribe for more heartwarming stories like this. Together, we can continue spreading hope and encouragement.